In the summer of 1906, a government surveyor named Elliot Forsyth arrived at the edge of Oribe, the oldest continuously inhabited settlement on the North American continent, with a clipboard, a theodolite, and a set of very specific instructions from Washington. He was there to document land boundaries. That was the official reason. But buried in the footnotes of a report almost no one ever read was a reference to something that had no business in a federal survey document. A reference to bells. Resonant bronze structures the Hopi had maintained in sealed underground chambers for generations, structures they refused to name in any language Forsyth could identify, and which the village elders told him, through an interpreter who grew visibly uncomfortable translating, had once made the blind see. Forsyth filed the note. The note was buried, and for most of the 20th century, it stayed buried, until 1907, when a Smithsonian researcher named Thomas Moran cross-referenced Forsyth's survey with Hopi oral testimony transcripts from the 1890s land allotment hearings. What Moran found did not just complicate the official timeline of southwestern indigenous history. It pointed towards something the academic establishment has never been able to fully explain and has largely chosen not to try. This is that story. To understand why what the Hopi elders said in 1907 matters, you have to understand what Oribe was. Conventional archaeology places the founding of Oribe at approximately 1100 CE, one of the oldest continuously occupied settlements in North America. That much is accepted. What is far less discussed is the growing body of architectural and acoustic evidence suggesting that the underground structures beneath the Hopi Mesa system, structures the Hopi call kivas, were not built by the ancestors of the people currently living above them. They were found by them. Hopi oral tradition is unusually precise about this distinction. The emergence narratives consistently describe the discovery of existing structures, tunnels, chambers, prepared in advance of the Hopi people's arrival. The Hopi did not build these chambers, they were the inheritors of them. This detail gets smoothed over in academic literature. Treated as mythology, as cosmological metaphor, as the kind of origin story every culture produces, and no serious researcher takes literally, but the Hopi themselves have never described it as metaphor. They have always described it as history. And when you examine what those underground chambers actually contain, the question of who built them becomes considerably harder to dismiss. Researchers who have studied the resonant frequencies of these chambers have found that they are tuned, not accidentally resonant in the way any enclosed stone space accumulates echo. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. Deliberately, precisely tuned to specific frequencies that correspond to no known ceremonial function in Hopi religious practice. The chambers amplify certain low-frequency tones to degrees that should not be physically possible given their dimensions. Stone walls that appear to be natural sandstone contain, in limited core sampling, trace concentrations of metallic compounds that occur nowhere in the surrounding geology. In at least 3 chambers, investigators have noted nodal points where sound behaves in ways that violate normal acoustic propagation patterns. Sound, in these spots, does not bounce, it converges. The Hopi elders who spoke to Thomas Moran in 1907 did not use the word acoustic. They did not use the word frequency. They did not use any technical vocabulary that would have made their statements easier to process and dismiss. What they said, through careful and deliberate translation, was this: the bells sing to the stone sings to the water sings to the eye, and people who could not see before they entered the chamber could see when they left it. Here is a question almost no one in the discourse around Tartaria and pre-Columbian history bothers to ask seriously. Where do the bells come in? Forsyth's 1906 survey is the first documented external reference to bell-like objects in association with the Hopi Kiva system, but it is not the first reference in the historical record. The sources are scattered across mission records, Spanish colonial administrative documents, and the private correspondence of 19th century ethnographers that has never been digitized. A trail going back considerably further. Fray Silvestre Velez de Escalante, the Franciscan friar who mapped portions of the southwest in 1776, made a passing reference in his journal to what local guides described as lugares donde el metal canta, places where the metal sings. He associated this with indigenous superstition and moved on. In 1848, a U.S. Army topographical engineer named Lutin. James Simpson, conducting surveys following the Mexican-American War, noted in his field journal that Hopi guides became reluctant to approach a mesa formation near what is now the Peabody Coal Lease area. When pressed, the guides said only that the ground there was occupied by something old, and that the old things did not welcome visitors who did not know the correct way to announce themselves. And then there are the bells themselves, which the elders in 1907 described to Moran as neither instruments nor tools, but as interface points, objects that mediated between the resonant properties of the chambers and the people who entered them. Objects, Moran wrote in his unpublished notes, that the elders described as having been there before everything. The Tartaria hypothesis holds that prior to the historical period we have been taught to accept as the beginning of sophisticated civilization in North America, there existed a global network of advanced cultural and technological exchange. The remnants survive in the architectural anomalies, acoustic phenomena, and out-of-place artifacts that appear with uncomfortable frequency in the archaeological record, and that the academic establishment has developed an unconscious system for ignoring. The hypothesis is controversial, aggressively dismissed by mainstream academia. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. And also, when you sit with the actual evidence, much harder to wave away than the dismissals would suggest. The acoustic engineering the Hopi Kiva system demonstrates is not consistent with ancestral Pueblo and construction techniques. The material composition of certain chamber walls is not consistent with the geological profile of the surrounding region. And the oral tradition that accompanies these structures, maintained with unusual consistency across centuries of disruption and forced assimilation, describes those structures as inheritances from a prior civilization. A civilization that, according to the elders, understood something about sound that we have forgotten. Here is what the elders actually said in 1907, the part Moran found most remarkable, and the part that has been most thoroughly buried. Moran conducted his interviews over 3 weeks in the spring of that year, working with an interpreter named David Kuchiumtua, whose family had served as cultural mediators between the Hopi and the federal government for a generation. The elder who agreed to speak most openly refused to give his name. Moran refers to him only as the keeper of the deep rooms. Born before the Civil War, before the railroad reached the Southwest, before the United States had established anything resembling a permanent administrative presence in Hopi territory, what this elder said, and what Moran painstakingly transcribed, was the following. The chambers below the village were not always used for ceremony. Ceremony came later. Ceremony was what the people did with the chambers because they had forgotten what the chambers were originally for, and ceremony was a way of remembering without knowing what you were remembering. The original purpose had to do with alignment, bringing the interior of a person into resonance with a frequency that existed in the stone, through the stone into the water, through the water into the light. The bells were the instruments of that alignment. When a person who could not see was brought into the chamber and the bells were sounded in the correct sequence, something happened to the interior arrangement of that person's perception. The word Kuchiumtua, translated as sight, was not the same word the Hopi used for ordinary visual function. It referred to a kind of seeing that included but extended beyond the physical eye. The elder was insistent this was not metaphor, that people who could not perceive light before entering the chamber could perceive it after. And then the elder said something that Moran underlined 3 times in his notes. We did not invent this. we received it. And the people who gave it to us were not Hopi, and were not any people who are still walking on this earth. The question of non-Hopi origins of the Kiva system is not entirely absent from mainstream archaeological discourse. It is just framed carefully to avoid certain implications. Researchers have noted that the architectural grammar of certain deep Kiva structures resembles underground ritual spaces in geographic contexts that should, by any conventional model of pre-Columbian cultural diffusion, have had no contact with the southwestern United States. Material culture from the deepest chamber levels includes object types fitting no recognized developmental sequence of ancestral Pueblo and craft production. Researchers in acoustic archaeology have noted that deliberately tuned resonant chambers appear across ancient sites worldwide, from the megalithic temples of Malta to the passage tombs of Ireland to the underground sanctuaries of Anatolia to the Kiva systems of the American Southwest. This pattern suggests either an extraordinary convergence of independent discovery or a shared inheritance from a prior civilization that understood acoustic technology at a level our scientific framework is only now beginning to approximate. In 2019, a team from the University of New Mexico published a paper in the Journal of Archaeological Science examining the acoustic properties of 3 Kiva sites on the Hopi Mesas. Careful, measured, and almost aggressively reluctant to draw the conclusions its own data support. The chambers produce standing wave patterns at frequencies between 40 and 110 Hz, below the threshold of normal human hearing, but within the range known to affect neurological function, visual cortex activity, and the perception of light. At 40 Hz specifically, a frequency appearing with notable regularity in the design parameters of these chambers, human brainwave activity shifts in ways neuroscience has been studying in relation to blindness and the restoration of perceptual function previously thought to be irreversible. The researchers from New Mexico did not mention the Hopi oral tradition about the restoration of sight. They did not cite Moran's notes. They wrote a careful paper and left the implications sitting on the page, enormous and unaddressed, like a room in a house that everyone walks past without opening the door. The bells Forsyth referenced in his 1906 survey were never located by any subsequent official investigation. The Hopi have never confirmed or denied their existence. The underground chambers that contain them, if they exist, have never been opened for external examination. What the elders said to Moran in 1907 was not published. His notes ended up in the Bancroft Library at Berkeley, where they sat uncatalogued for decades before a researcher named Patricia Witherspoon found them in 1991. She wrote a brief article for a small academic journal. It received almost no attention. It was Witherspoon's article that eventually led to the University of New Mexico research. That long thread connecting a surveyor's offhand note in 1906 to a neuroscience-adjacent finding in 2019 is itself part of the story. How inconvenient knowledge survives. Not by being loud, by staying in the record just long enough to be found by the person looking for exactly the right thing. Here is what we know, not as hypothesis, but as documented fact. The Hopi oral tradition maintains, across centuries, that the structures beneath their mesas were not built by their ancestors, but were found by them, not contested by the Hopi, simply not discussed by an academic establishment that prefers a tidier narrative. The acoustic engineering demonstrates properties exceeding the capacity attributed to ancestral Puebloan builders, documented, simply not emphasized. The frequencies those chambers produce correspond to neurological effects on visual perception that modern neuroscience has only recently begun to understand, documented, never connected in mainstream academic literature. And the elders who spoke in 1907 described the bells as objects that mediated between those frequencies and the human beings who entered the chambers, producing effects not explicable within the framework of ceremony or placebo, but consistent with what we now know about the neurological impact of infrasound on the visual cortex. The keeper of the deep rooms said one more thing to Moran in the final week of their conversations, something Kuchiumptewa hesitated to translate. He said, "The people who built the chambers were not trying to restore sight. They were trying to restore something that sight was only a part of." And what was not lost because of any catastrophe or any forgetting. It was put away, hidden on purpose, against the time when the world would need to find it again. Against the time, the elder said, which is now. Forsyth's survey report from 1906 is held in the National Archives. The reference to the bells is on page 47 of a 63-page document, one sentence long, never cited in any published work. Moran's notes are in the Bancroft Library at Berkeley. The 1907 Hopi interview section has not been digitized and can only be read in person. The thread is there. It has always been there. From a surveyor who noticed something he was not supposed to notice, to elders who decided 1907 was the moment to say certain things out loud for the first time, to a chain of researchers across a century who each found one piece and could not quite see the shape of what they were holding. The shape is this. Somewhere beneath the oldest inhabited place in North America, in chambers that no one built and everyone has maintained, there are objects the people above them have been keeping for longer than history records. Objects from a civilization whose name we do not know, and whose existence the world has largely agreed to pretend away. Objects that once did something to human perception that we are only now beginning to understand. And the elders who knew this chose a specific moment to begin to say so. They chose 1907. Nobody has ever satisfactorily explained why.